Hello everyone, I'm Alba, a junior game designer, and let me welcome you to my third devlog of Dance Again. Dance Again is a rhythm game played with both hands, one to hit the notes coming towards you, and the other one to move the character to hit the notes on the floor. In the last devlog, I explained my thought process behind the dialogue system, the guidelines I designed in order to create the characters, and a few other smaller changes, such as a new art style, a few animation tests, and a saving system. When I talked about the new art style and the animations, I mentioned I needed to separate the upper body from the lower one. Let's go over that first, okay? The reason why I needed to do that was because I wanted the character to do different poses depending on what note the player pressed, but I also needed them to be able to move around at the same time. If I did the character as one single piece, and I moved them while pressing the notes, they would either do the pose or the walking animation. However, like I've said, that's not what I wanted. It would look awkward to have the character stay in one single pose while moving around, and it would feel unsatisfying to simply have them walk around when the player is pressing the note to the beat of the song. Thus, I decided I would divide the character in two halves. The upper one would do the poses, while the lower one would do the walking. As you can see, it now works as expected. If I hit the notes, the character poses. If I move the character, they walk. And if I hit a note while moving the character, they pose and walk at the same time. Now that I have that solved, I can create the final animations. I'm looking forward to drawing the poses especially, they're really fun. In fact, to make it more eye-catching and engaging, I will create different poses for every direction. I'm sure that this will motivate the players to follow the rhythm of the song even when there are no notes, just because they want to create their own dance routine. I'm actually really excited about creating the rhythm maps for the songs and making different difficulty levels too. Which brings me to my next point. I want Dance Again to be accessible to as many people as possible. I want it to be friendly towards new players so that people who have never touched a video game before can get into them and enjoy this medium if they so desire. However, a game that's so skill-based, such as this one, can also be seen as a challenge for many experienced players. So, how do we tie all of this together? Let me show you my take on this. If you played the prototype build of the game, link in the description, you probably have noticed that the notes on the ground are not as strict as the ones coming towards the player. AKA, it is much easier to get a perfect on the notes on the ground and they're more difficult to miss. But why is that? I decided to do this because even for experienced players, focusing on different stimuli while controlling different things with different motions, with different speeds at different intervals with both hands at once is kind of a difficult task. Following the rhythm of the song with the right hand is relatively easy, and moving the character with the left is a piece of cake, but combining the two is what makes it complicated. Thus, I decided to make the notes on the ground more permissive, since they're easier to mess up, at least from what I've seen while playtesting. However, I have to tweak this, as now these notes are probably too easy to hit. We'll see how difficult it truly is once I create more complex songs and as I continue playtesting. I'll keep you updated on it. Another thing I did to make the game more friendly is to not take away points of the score when the player misses a note. Instead, the score simply doesn't increase. I've seen some games where the player loses part of their score when they miss a note, and I find that this punishes them too much for what I'm trying to achieve with my game. I want to encourage the player to keep trying and to not give up, especially new players. If I lower the score for every missed note, it would make them feel bad and they might think that they're just not made to play games after all. This is the complete opposite of what I want, so I decided to let the missed notes simply not increase the score. That's punishment enough. On a similar note, you probably noticed that I added a combo to the HUD. I will talk more about the HUD in a few minutes, but there's something I want to mention of how I designed it in this part of the video, since it's relevant to the topic of accessibility and difficulty. Combos are a very iconic part of rhythm games, and they usually follow the same guidelines. When the player hits a few notes one after the other without missing a single one, the number goes up. If they miss a note, it goes back to 0. Pretty simple, we all know how they work. However, depending on what you count as a hit note, you can make getting a higher combo more or less difficult. For example, if you only count perfect notes, getting a combo will be way more difficult than if you count greats too. For me, like I've said already, making this game friendly to newcomers is very important, and so I decided to count all the options for hitting the notes as a success note, except for the miss notes obviously. However, I have to add that this will not affect the more experienced players at all. The highest possible attainable score is still a full perfect combo, and that is not easy to achieve. The challenge aspect is still there, this only makes the entrance to the game easier for newer players. There will also be a hidden combo for only perfect hits that will be visible once the song ends. This is done to let players, especially the ones looking for a challenge, see their progress with the more complicated combo rather than the easier, more permissive one. I did not include this in the HUD, however, since it would be too much information and it might either distract or confuse the player. Next thing I want to talk about is the difficulty progression in the game as a whole and how I'm designing the song maps. Okay, so first things first. This game has the potential to be really difficult to master. However, we have to start at the beginning and unpack what makes this game hard to begin with in order to make a proper learning curve for the player. Like I've mentioned, following the rhythm of the song and controlling the character separately are relatively easy things to do. Combining them is what makes it complex. Thus, what I need to do first, especially if I want people who have never played a game before to even attempt to play this one, is to teach these two mechanics on their own. This does not mean I will make an entire song only with the notes that move towards the player and another one with only the ground notes. No. What it means is that I will make a version of each song with clearly separated parts for each note type, and then I will progressively unify them. This is done so the player gets used to both types of interaction on their own and then learns to play with them all at once. Obviously, this being the easiest level for each song, there will be few notes to hit so that the player can see them clearly and prepare themselves for them in advance. On the easier levels in general, the first few notes will be somewhat repetitive so that the player gets a feel for the rhythm of the song, as well as the input they'll be using. Additionally, the notes on the ground will require vertical and horizontal movements only. After that, we'll have a few small sections where both things are combined, again with few notes to let the player get used to the combination of both mechanics at once. Once the player is used to that, we'll move to diagonal movements for the notes on the floor and a few double notes for the ones coming towards the player. Then, we'll increase the frequency of the notes and the movements required to get the notes on the floor, progressively, slowly, letting the player learn the required skills to master the game, but always presenting them with something that challenges them. The learning curve is very, very, very important. If you give too much information at once, or if you make it too difficult for the players to understand and assimilate the knowledge they're receiving, most players will simply put down the controller and look for another game. However, if you make the curve too subtle, if you don't give them enough engagement and new things to try every so often, it's likely they will get bored and, again, look for another game to play. You have to think about your average player and look at the game through their eyes. What stands out? What catches their attention? The order in which they attempt to do things in-game, boundaries they might test. You have to foresee how they will act and prepare the game accordingly, so that they can have the best possible experience. That is your goal. Alright, what else? There are many aspects of games that make it difficult for a lot of people to play them. Such things can be camera shakes, no subtitles, the controls per se, and many, many more. I've already mentioned I want this game to be accessible, but this does not mean that I want the game to be accessible for new players only. I want to give the option to modify certain inputs, and I also want to reduce the amount of obstacles that people face when they want to play a game as much as possible in Dance Again. Unfortunately, I don't have much to report on this aspect as of now, but I will come back to it in the future. What I do have to talk about though is the HUD. The HUD Designing and developing the game mechanics is important, but if the player doesn't understand or doesn't receive the information you want them to have at all, then we have a problem. One way of solving this is by using the HUD and the user interface. This can make or break a game, so be very careful when designing this part. Alright, let's start! As a player in Dance Again, there are a few things you might want feedback on. The main one is how well you're hitting the notes, obviously, if you're hitting them on time or not. The rest are not mandatory, but excluding them would be a waste and it would make the game less engaging as well. These things are the current combo, the score multiplier, and the score itself. So, these are the things I need to inform the player about as they're playing Dance Again. But how would I go about this? Well, if you've seen the previous devlogs, you might have noticed that I added two text parameters on the top right that show the score and the multiplier. This is obviously not the way to go, and I only did that for testing purposes. So, once the game mechanics were already in motion and working as I wanted them to, I focused on changing the text parameters into something that could be considered part of the game and not a simple debug element. The first thing I did was take a moment to look at my game. I imagined my average player playing the game, and I analyzed where their attention was in each moment. By doing this, I confirmed something that I already suspected since the beginning of the creation of this game. The attention of the player is focused on the character they're controlling. And you might say, but Alba, the player will probably be looking at the notes that are moving towards them and the notes appearing on the floor. They can't focus on their character. And that might be true in some cases, especially for new players or whenever there aren't that many notes on the screen. However, in rhythm games whose note buttons don't change position, once the song starts getting more complicated and there are way more notes, the players tend to have their attention on where the notes are going to the place where they have to press the button for the note to be counted as hit. So, for example, in DDR, the player focuses on this part of the screen. On the other hand, rhythm games that don't have a specific place for the note button, and whose notes can appear anywhere, you could say that the player tends to have a broader eye view, yes, but they also tend to focus on a specific area surrounding the last note they pressed. Because of this, most games of this style put the next few notes relatively close to the last one pressed. This is done so that the player can focus on hitting the notes and doesn't have to lose precision because they're focusing on the entire screen all at once. If you look at Osu, for example, most song maps are mapped out as a... how to say this? Sort of like a snake? It's like the player is following a line that moves around the screen. So how does this translate to Dance Again? Well, first of all, we have to acknowledge that Dance Again has both types of notes. The ones that have a specific place they move towards, and the notes that appear in different places. In this particular case, the player focuses roughly on this part of the screen, following the character. For me, this implies that the notes on the ground can only appear in this specific area or a bit further, inside this other circle. These notes here will not be as in focus as the rest, but they will catch the player's attention nevertheless. What I can't do is put a random note all the way to the right when the player is all the way to the left. I already had the movement restriction, as they would most likely not be able to even reach the note, but now I have even more reasons to put the ground notes in a snake-like pattern, like Osu, one after the other. Plus, this also makes the dancing feel that I want the player to have even more prominent and powerful, as you're dancing your way through the room to the next note. So, with that taken into account, and going back to the reason I'm explaining this whole thing, the important information that I wanted my player to have needed to be in this part of the screen as well. It needed to be in the section the player is focused on, otherwise they will miss it or it will distract them from the actual gameplay. Thus, what I did was put the HUD surrounding the player. I tried different approaches, but in the end, the lines coming out of the player and the numbers on top of them is the one I like the most. However, I have one problem with this, and it is the fact that I don't know where to include the score. I was thinking about adding it to the top, as a lot of rhythm games do, and make it kind of like a slider, something that fills up as the player gets a higher and higher score. Unfortunately, that would mean putting it out of the focus of the player, and I'm afraid it might not work. I thought about putting it in the center, like everything else, but I'm not convinced. I feel like there would be too much going on and it would end up being more confusing than helpful. I have to go back to the drawing board with this one, I'm afraid, but I'll let you know when I come up with a solution. Next up are the notes themselves, specifically the ones moving towards the player. You may have noticed I changed their design. At first, I used some sprites I created from another rhythm game I participated in as placeholder art while I was programming everything. However, from the beginning I knew I wanted these notes to not be circles and actually be arrows. Why is that? Well, there are a few reasons. One of them is to make it easier for the player to identify which note is approaching them. You would think that this would be obvious since the notes are always coming from the same way, so for example the up notes will always come from above the player. The right notes will always come from the right, and so on. Plus, they are separated from each other, there's no room for confusing them with one another. However, the right notes will always come from the right, yes, but they move towards the left. So some players might think these notes are actually left notes, unconsciously. This kinda reminds me of the discussion about games that use mouse control. If I move the mouse forward, will the camera look up or down? I believe it's kind of the same thing here, so just to avoid confusion, I wanted the notes to be extremely clear. Another thing that makes this easier for the player is the fact that the directions the notes are coming from are exactly how the arrow keys are placed in the keyboard. Furthermore, another issue changing the circles to arrows solved is a possible confusion between these notes and the ones on the ground. The notes on the ground will also have different art in the near future, but they will likely stay as circles. So, separating the two types makes it easier to identify when a note is on the ground and when a note is coming towards the player, especially if they're moving around the room. Which reminds me, notice that the buttons and the arrows have a white borderline. At first, I gave the arrows the thicker border in order to make them stand out from the background. However, when I put the prototype up for playtesting, several people notified me that it was difficult to see when to press the keys on the keyboard since the arrows block the button. That was a rookie mistake on my part, and I'm really thankful that they made me see it. I was too focused on separating the arrows from the background. This helped me take a step back and I fixed the issue accordingly. And that concludes this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, like I've mentioned, if you want to play Dance Again as I'm developing it, you can check the link in the description. It will take you to my itch.io page, where you can find the game. I will be updating it there, so check it out if you want. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to join me on this journey as I develop Dance Again. And follow my Twitter and Instagram accounts for quicker and smaller updates. I'll also let you know when a new version of Dance Again comes out through them. Thanks for watching, see you soon!